fine.
Okay, unfortunately, it sounds like to me that it's a problem with your setup, so I don't think anything we can do to help you from here. So we're just gonna press on one thing that I should have mentioned is that we are recording this, and so the recording will be made available to everyone if they want to rewatch it. Okay? And so for the presentations on this topic to a wide array of civic, religious, business, and professional organizations. In 2020, he was appointed by California Governor Gavin Newsom to the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board. He also serves on the Bay Conservation and Development Commission and is a member of the Board of Directors of the Union of Concerned Scientists. And Andy has fortunately been kind enough to speak to Sustainable Rossmoor and the Rossmoor community a number of times. He's always been one of our favorites, certainly one of my favorite speakers on this topic. And one of the things I'm sure he will tell you, if not, we'll try him for that. He has said many times before, he's willing to go anywhere at any time to talk to anybody about climate change. So if you've got an organization that you think might be interested, in a talk like this, Andy will give us, you can see his website is andrewgunther.com. Okay. With that, let me turn it over to Andy Gunther.
Thank you, Brad. I'm sorry that I am only with you virtually tonight, but I'm traveling down to see my elderly parents who are in their 90s in the next day or two, and I'm trying to make sure that I limit my exposure to others at the moment. So, like all of us, I want to live in a world that's safe and productive and as healthy as the world that we all inherited from our great-grandparents. And today, I'm going to explain to you why the world scientific community has concluded that our future is going to take a serious turn for the worse. And because we've understood this threat for decades, but have done virtually nothing about it, we have now reached the stage of an emergency. Without immediate and sustained action, we risk disrupting the planet's climate beyond civilization's capacity to respond. But before I go there, let me say what I'm not going to tell you. So I'm not going to tell you what to believe. And I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. You have your own values you use to make those determinations. What I am going to tell you about is the scientific evidence that documents we have a big problem. And in so doing, I'm going to ask that you listen to the skeptics, the real skeptics, the scientists. Objective skepticism is the heart of the scientific method. The oldest scientific society in the world, the Royal Society of London, founded in 1662, has as its motto, "Don't take anybody's word for it." Now, we can think about our predicament by framing it with three questions, which is must we change, can we change, and will we change? To understand why this answer to this question is yes, we really have to start with this guy. Fourier was a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson's. He marched with Napoleon, and he was a physicist studying heat. And it is Fourier who first postulated that the Earth's atmosphere acts like a blanket, keeping the Earth warmer than it otherwise would be. And this is now a principle of physics known as the greenhouse effect. The Earth gets almost all of its energy from the sun. Most of the sun's rays pass through the atmosphere, striking the planet and warming it up. And just like anything else that warms up, the Earth starts radiating heat in the form of infrared radiation. Now, most of that radiation escapes into outer space. But because there are these heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, some of that outgoing radiation is absorbed by those gases and then radiated back down to the surface. And that's why the Earth has the temperature that it does. Mars has a very thin atmosphere, a very weak greenhouse effect. It's a very cold place. Venus has a very thick atmosphere, a very powerful greenhouse effect, and has a surface temperature close to that of molten lead. And this pattern isn't because of the relative positions of the planets compared to the sun, because Mercury, which of course is the closest planet to the sun, has a very thin atmosphere, very weak greenhouse effect, and has a surface temperature well below that of Venus. Now, over the last 250 and 300 years, humans have been adding prodigious amounts of these heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere by burning coal, oil, and natural gas and chopping down forests. And this has had the effect of thickening that layer of heat-trapping gases. So now, energy that used to escape into outer space is absorbed by gases in the atmosphere and radiated back down to the surface. And that extra energy is forcing our climate to change. So Fourier postulates this in the 1820s. In 1859, Irish physicist John Tyndall demonstrates in the laboratory that there are gases in the atmosphere that can absorb heat. And this is what he concludes. The atmosphere admits the entrance of the solar heat, but checks its exit, and the result is a tendency to accumulate heat at the surface of the planet. This basic physical reality we've known for 170 years. And this heat is creating an emergency. Now, these concepts were combined into the theory of global warming that was published by Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius in 1896. Now, this is 20 years before Berkeley professor Alfred Wegener publishes the theory of continental drift. So this has been around for a long time. Here's Arrhenius in the first page of his paper. He calculated what the temperature of the Earth would be if we made that blanket twice as thick by doubling the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the answer he got, about 4 to 6 degrees centigrade, is very close to the answer we get today. And he did it with just a piece of paper and a pencil. And that shows you how basic the physical principles are that underlie our emergency. Now, when Arrhenius made his calculations, human emissions had only really just started, as you see there by the red line. But by the time Lyndon Johnson was president, we were seeing carbon dioxide accumulate in the atmosphere, and he was warned about this problem by his scientific advisory committee. And although he spoke publicly about it, nothing was done. And the science was clear not only to government scientists, but to the fossil fuel industry as well. Here's an example of one of their conclusions from 1977. Right? There's general agreement that mankind is influencing the global climate. Now, when President Carter was warned by the Department of Defense in 1979 that this problem, it's not just going to warm up the planet and change the climate, it's going to be a national security threat. And so President Carter asked our National Academy of Sciences to double check the work of the Department of Defense. And here's what our National Academy of Sciences concluded about carbon emissions in 1979. And there's no reason to believe these changes will be negligible. But we also have to remember that at this time, right, when President Carter, if you recall, he put solar panels on the White House, and he suggested we get half of our 20% of our electricity from renewable energy by the year 2000. And that would have been a good idea, but we didn't do it. And one of the reasons we didn't do it is because we elected Ronald Reagan, who just had no interest in these issues. But another key point to remember is that in the 1980s and continuing today is an organized campaign to deceive the American people and their political leaders about this problem. And it's organized and operated by the fossil fuel industry who wants to continue to sell these products. So we can see, for example, here's an ad in the New York Times from Mobil Oil. And of course, their scientists were telling them that this isn't true. Now, this campaign of deception can be easily seen when we examine the response to the testimony of James Hansen of NASA before Congress. And I want to go into this just to show you the kind of things that were said to Congress and the kind of understanding we had at that time. And it was in 1988. It was actually a sweltering June day. And Jim Hansen went before Congress and he said that greenhouse warming is almost certainly underway. And this was the first time a leading scientist had really said this to Congress. This resulted in a lot of political activity, the signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Rio in 1992, and 154 countries pledged to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. And to this day, Jim Hansen is a global leader in the effort to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. But as we were signing the Rio Treaty, and as George H.W. Bush said he was going to bring the White House effect to bear on the greenhouse effect, which didn't really happen, the fossil fuel industry misinformation program went into high gear. And we can see what happened by looking at what Jim Hansen told Congress. So what Hansen had done is created a model of the average temperature that projected the average temperature of the Earth. And he could see that it accurately predicted the past temperatures of the Earth. And so now he used it to project the future. The key uncertainty he had was how much emissions would humans produce in the coming decades. And so what he did is he had three scenarios. He had a high emission scenario here, scenario A. He had an emission scenario that was slightly less, which you see here in the blue line. Then he had a scenario in which we stopped emitting greenhouse gases in the year 2000. And you can see then that the temperature of the planet starts to level off. Now, of course, we can see, well, how accurate was Hansen's predictions, because we can look at the measured temperature, and there you see it in the red, and you can see we're pretty close to scenario B. Now, the fossil fuel industry started pumping out through multiple institutes and think tanks these ideas that Hansen was wrong, that scientists are alarmists. It's really right out of the paranoid style of politics, you know. And this reached a peak with a testimony of the Cato Institute's Patrick Michaels before Congress in 1997. And I'm going to show you what he did. Yeah, Michaels, in my opinion, perpetrated a fraud on Congress and the American people. What he did is he showed Hansen's work, and he showed only the high emissions scenario. And then he compared the high emissions scenario, which at that time they knew already was a little inaccurate, to the actual temperatures. And he said, look at this huge difference. This shows that, you know, that Hansen is an alarmist, that the scientists are trying to scare us. And here's the actual slide that Michaels shared with Congress. But of course, if you put Hansen's other scenarios back on the screen, you see that in fact, the difference was really very small. The narrative here is that scientists are hyping worst cases to make money. They're fear mongers. And not only is this a myth supported by fabrications like we see here, but it's also just plain wrong. Science is actually a very conservative enterprise where claims of knowledge are greeted with skepticism. Remember the motto of the Royal Society, right? Don't take anybody's word for it. And because of this, when scientists make projections, they're pretty conservative. And if we're exceeding these projections, that's another way we know that we're in an emergency situation. There's three ways science is really a conservative enterprise. The first is the standard of proof that scientists use. Now, we're all familiar with certain standards of proof, like, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt for criminal convictions, or more likely than not for civil trials. Scientists use the chances I'm right are at least 20 to 1. And this is the 95% confidence limit for those familiar with statistics. But scientific historian Naomi Oreskes of Harvard points out that this is really a value judgment. And the value it reflects is that one of the worst mistakes a scientist can make is to think an effect is real when it's not. You can think of it as wanting to be sure you're not gullible, you're not fooling yourself, you don't have undue faith in your own ideas. And so this is a long tradition that valorizes in science, that valorizes skepticism. So in essence, what's happening here is that scientists sort of play dumb on purpose. But what this means is that science is prone to what are called type 2 errors, where you're too conservative. You miss causes and effects that are really there. And this has an implication, obviously, for climate change. You know, and people like to use the example, you don't want the fire department to make type 2 errors, right? You want them to respond whenever there's an alarm, whether it turns out to be a false alarm or not. Scientists are also very reticent to be seen as speculating or alarmist. A lot of scientists never talk in public. When they do, they talk in probabilities. Hansen says there's actually a culture of scientific reticence. He says scientists are reticent to conclude and communicate scenarios that would be disturbing to employers, funders, governments, and the public. And the other thing is that scientists don't project what they can't model. We're just learning, for example, about how great ice sheets break apart and melt. And we don't really understand that. So our models have, until just recently, not included this, even though we know somehow or another it's going to happen, but we don't know how to project it, so we haven't been including it. And so our sea level rise estimates, for example, have been very conservative. So all this just goes to show that scientific culture and convention leads to underestimating future risk. And that's another reason we find ourselves in an emergency. We're seeing with our own eyes and instruments that what Arrhenius and other scientists predicted is turning out to be true, right? The Earth is getting hotter. There are 5 independent data sets. They all show the same thing. The distribution of heating is not uniform around the planet. There's more heating in the Arctic than there is in the temperate regions. This is a pattern called Arctic amplification that was predicted by the Department of Defense and the National Academy of Sciences in their reports to President Carter. Now, some might say, well, humans are really adaptable, right? So we can deal with a few degrees rise in temperature. And the best way to understand the challenge that this puts to us is to look at the temperatures that have been in existence during the time that human civilization has evolved, about the last 10,000 years. And when we look at the last 10,000 years, this is what we see. The temperatures went up about 1 degree Fahrenheit over 5,000 years, and then they came back down over the next 5,000 years, except, as you can see right at the end of that blue line, suddenly the temperature's gone up over 1 degree Fahrenheit in just 200 years. That is our new climate, right? We have already changed the climate. And if we don't immediately transition away from fossil fuels, this is where we're going to go by 2100. Now, there's some debate about whether it'll be 8 degrees Fahrenheit or 6 degrees Fahrenheit, but there's no debate about the direction of the change. It's like when you turn the heat up under the kettle, the water in the kettle doesn't start cooling down on its own. We can think of this as like we're on a temperature elevator. If we suddenly get serious about this transition and stop emitting greenhouse gases, the climate's not like a rubber band. We're not going to go back to where we were. We're just going to get off on a higher floor. And I'll show you a graph here that just gives you a sense. The different colored lines are the different scenarios for future emissions. And you can see that as we eventually stop emissions, then the temperature of the Earth pretty much levels off at a higher, more energetic place. So it doesn't just go back to the way it was before. We've already changed the climate. And we can see why when we look at the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we have a record now that goes back 800,000 years because we can measure tiny bubbles of air captured in glacial ice. And when we go back in time, I'll show you this data now. Here's what we see. We're going, the blue is the carbon dioxide going back in time from right to left. And you can see our current concentration is vastly above anything we've seen in the last 800,000 years, going up 200 times faster than any other time in this record. And here you can see another key driver of the emergency. And that's because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a long time. So all the time that it's up there, it's absorbing energy that used to go into outer space and is now being pumped back down to the planet. So even if we could magically eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, the temperature of the planet would keep rising for a while because of the emissions already there. And if we don't have an immediate sustained effort to change this situation, if we do not transition away from fossil fuels, then this is where we're going to be in just 40 years. we were going to have wrapped so many blankets around the earth that the temperatures will be so extreme and the weather will be so altered that civilization will not survive as we know it today. Now, some people also want to know, how do we know this isn't some kind of natural phenomenon? Which is a great question. And scientists have been asking that question for many, many years. So the easiest way to think about that, I've come to think about this, is just that the Earth is a huge thing, right? So you have to have an enormously powerful source of energy if you're going to change its temperature. The only thing that's powerful that we know of is the sun. So one thing that could happen is that the Earth could get closer to the sun. If the Earth got closer to the sun, the Earth would heat up. And in fact, the Earth's orbit is not stationary. It oscillates between being more and less elliptical. And when it's more elliptical, the Earth spends more time further away from the sun and ice accumulates on the planet. That's one of the drivers of the ice ages. But these changes happened on the scale of 40,000 to 100,000 years. So they can't explain the temperature change we're seeing in the last 10 years. Now, another thing that happened is just if the sun got hotter, the Earth would get hotter. And in fact, the sun's output does vary. And it varies on the scale of decades. So this is a possible explanation, except that the output of the sun has been in a downward trend for the last several decades, and the changes are not enough to explain the temperature change that we are seeing on the planet. We can see this in a graphical sense by looking at a projection for the temperature of the ocean from a model. This is from Tim Barnett's lab in San Diego. And so what you see here is these natural factors. Those dips are big volcanic eruptions that put a parasol over the Earth, but only for a couple of years. And then those particles settle out and we get back to the temperature we were at before the eruption. Now, if you put into the model the increase in greenhouse gases that we're measuring, well, then the model says, well, that's going to capture more energy. It's going to heat the planet. So the ocean temperature should be somewhere in this range. Now we have a hypothesis we can test because we can go out and measure the temperature of the ocean. And when we do that, this is what we see. The key point here is that there is no explanation for what is going on, except for the impact of greenhouse gases capturing more of the sun's energy. And for those of you who are fans of logic, there is also no explanation for why greenhouse gases are not causing what we're measuring. And this is why in 2007, the Supreme Court held that the US EPA had to regulate greenhouse gases as a threat to public health and safety pursuant to the Clean Air Act, because there's no other explanation for what's going on. And as the planet heats up, our climate is going to be disrupted. And climate disruption is going to have enormous effects. We're going to see changes in the availability of water, changes in the productivity of farms and forests and fisheries. This is going to make it ever more difficult to feed the people of the world. We're already seeing changes in the availability of water in California, where we capture our snowmelt pulse in the spring and we use that water in the summer and the fall when it doesn't rain. But the snowmelt pulse is getting smaller because we're getting more precipitation in the winter as rain instead of snow. That's the same thing as saying that the snow level in the Sierras is rising. And so we see this pattern being measured by the Department of Water Resources in the Sacramento River, which is our largest river. We're going to see increased prevalence of oppressive heat and humidity. This is something obviously we're seeing all over the planet right at the moment, right? Here's a projection for the future of Contra Costa County. You know, overall, heat that used to occur once every 50 years is now likely to occur once every 10 years. This intense heat we just saw in Texas and in Europe, and now in the Pacific Northwest, and last year's amazing heat wave in the Pacific Northwest was described as one of the most anomalous climate events ever witnessed. You know, heat affects cognitive performance, labor productivity, agricultural yields. It influences interpersonal and intergroup conflict, right? And the important thing to remember here, with all the effects that we're talking about, is that we still determine now how bad it gets. The future we get is the future we choose. If we have an immediate and sustained effort to transition away from fossil fuels, then here's what Contra Costa County is going to look like at the end of the century. We go down from 37 days above 90 degrees, from 84 down to 37 degrees above 90. We're going to see a change in the concentration of air pollutants, both because of more dust, because lakes are getting smaller. This is a big issue now in Salt Lake City. You may have seen it's also happening in Mono Lake here in California. We are also going to see more photochemical smog because that's a temperature-dependent process. We're seeing a change in the geography of disease. The whole idea of tropical diseases exists because the creatures that transfer those diseases between human beings live in the tropics, but no more. As our climate changes, the distribution of these creatures is changing, like Aedes aegypti, the Asian tiger mosquito. This is the creature that transfers Zika, dengue, yellow fever, and chikungunya between people. It's now firmly established in southern United States. If you have friends or family in Southern California and they complain about getting mosquito bites around their ankles, it's probably this guy who they tend to fly very low to the ground. We're going to see increased damages from storms and droughts and wildfires. Again, this is obvious. In fact, storms, droughts, wildfires, and heat are now making the summer the danger season instead of our vacation season. We're going to see property loss from sea level rise and coastal erosion. This is going to be a big deal in the Bay Area. And we're seeing a change in the distribution and abundance of species. All over the world, populations of fish, birds, mammals, insects, amphibians, and reptiles have declined by enormous amounts. And this is because the ecosystems that these animals depend on are being disrupted. And they are the same ecosystems that we depend upon. When we look at sea level rise, one of the interesting things is that we have in San Francisco the oldest tide gauge in the United States at Fort Point at the Golden Gate. And you can see here that sea level has risen slow, about 7 or 8 inches since around 1900, but half of that has been since 1993. And sea level rise is going to accelerate in the future. Again, it depends upon how much our emissions are. Here are 2 graphs, the red line and the blue line, each with its own uncertainty around it. And the only difference between these 2 is the amount of emissions humans put out. Now, there's another line to go on this graph, which is this one. And this is a scenario that was put out by the Ocean Protection Council several years ago, California Ocean Protection Council. And it's there not because it's likely, but because it's plausible. And this is what we're seeing. One of the first times we're seeing these concepts of the ice sheet breakup and the fact that it might go much faster than we thought, that big pieces of glaciers might fall into the ocean, not just glaciers melting and running slowly into the ocean to increase sea level. Now, one of the things that we just found out just recently is that it looks like this graph that I'm showing you now, the one from 2017, is going to be made a little less steep, that we won't get to that 8 to 10 feet until about 2150 instead of 2100. In my end, it doesn't really matter that much. We still have a lot of work to do to prepare for that future. We can already see that future around the Bay Area now. When we go out at our king tides, our highest tides, when the moon and the sun are lined up, and we get the maximum gravitational pull on the ocean, these are our highest tides, but these will be normal tides in decades to come. In the Bay Area, our transportation infrastructure has been, a lot of it been built on fill around the bay, and it's going to be very, very vulnerable to the rising ocean levels. And remember, we're committed to these rising ocean levels. The only question is how fast it happens. Same thing with the coastal erosion, where because of higher wave heights and higher ocean levels, we're seeing erosion like this in Pacifica. This apartment building has become sort of an iconic image, but this is happening all over the country. In addition, another critical physical fact that we unfortunately have to face is that warm air holds more moisture. Again, this is something you can demonstrate in the laboratory. And so that means when it rains now, there's more moisture in the atmosphere to come down as precipitation. And we are seeing more downpours all over the country and all over the world. Meteorologists are calling these things rain bombs, right? And you just open up the newspaper every week, you'll see something like this. A month of rain fell in one morning somewhere, right? It was Washington in 2019. In April, it was in South Africa. This was a huge, over 400 people died in this flood. And just last month, it was in Yellowstone, right? And just yesterday, it was in St. Louis. And this is happening all over the country. And also, and these aren't just natural disasters anymore, right? They all have a human component driven by, they're all more powerful because of the energy being captured on the planet. And these things are happening together now in countries. Just last month, China was dealing with the worst flooding in decades in submerging houses and cars in the south, while there were record high heat waves in the north buckling roads, right? And while downpours are more intense when it rains, the higher temperatures are also increasing aridity. And of course, in California, that's leading to these incredibly intense fires, right? The fire season in California, it's virtually all year round now. In 2020, 4 million acres burned, which was twice the previous maximum. And these fires, like we're seeing with the Oak Fire right now, are very, very intense. They kind of generate their own weather. They throw sparks 2 miles ahead of themselves, making it very, very difficult to control them until the weather changes. And so some of these fires burn, we're seeing fires burn for months during the summer. And these fires can impact people far away from the flames, like us, right? It was bad in 2017. It was even worse in 2020. And these intensified weather extremes are leading to the collapse of insurance markets, which is another indicator of the emergency that we're in. This is particularly happening in the South because traditionally that insurance market has a lot more smaller companies. In Florida and Louisiana, many companies have gone insolvent just in 2022, and it's making it harder and harder for homeowners to find insurance. In California, we're seeing it with fire insurance. It's getting harder and harder if you live in the Sierras to find fire insurance. One of the reasons that these impacts are accelerating and generating this emergency is if we go back to our graph of human emissions, right? What this line actually tells us, if we study the graph, is that half of all human emissions have happened since around 1980. So this huge dose of carbon to the atmosphere has caused way more heat to get captured in the last few decades than in decades previous. And that's generating a lot more of this extreme weather. And as I said before, things are not just going to go back to normal, right? Here's the way that climate scientists put it. Right? For those alive today, the climate they're experiencing now will be the mildest climate they'll ever know. Here's another recent conclusion. Rendering portions of the Earth uninhabitable. We can see this happening with the data we already have. And I'm going to show this to you now. So here's a distribution of temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere in the summer. And it's all the temperatures measured between 1951 and 1980. So you can see in some places it's warmer, in some places it's colder, and most of the temperatures are in this central tendency, that white area. So let's use this as our baseline, and that's what that green line is. Now, let's just look at the temperatures that we've measured since 1980, okay? So here's the 10 years between 1983 and 1993. And just as scientists projected, things are warming up. But that means this whole distribution shifts away from the green line. When we look at 1994 to 2004, oh, it's getting more. And what you see suddenly is we now have 4 categories on the graph because we have this extremely hot area that's appearing on the tail of the curve on the right. When we look at 2005 to 2015, it's even larger. And so we now have the situation where extreme temperatures, which used to be only over 0.1% of the Earth's surface, are now over 14% of the Earth's surface. And if this isn't enough to get that emergency feeling in your gut, I haven't even explained the most serious problem yet, which is that as we add more and more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, we're pushing the planet towards tipping points where the climate will start changing. And even if we reduce our emissions, it won't make a difference, right? Evidence is mounting that these tipping points could be more likely than was thought and would commit the world to long-term irreversible changes. It's kind of like shoveling your walk to get the snow off it during a major blizzard. And our emissions reduction efforts are the shovel, but we can't get rid of it fast enough. So I want to look at some of these tipping points to investigate this issue a little bit further. One of them is in the Arctic. Most people are aware that the Arctic ice cap has been shrinking with that heating of the Arctic. Right? I'll show you an animation now of the Arctic ice cap between 1984 and 2016. The graph shows you how thick the ice is. And you're going to see that as the ice cap shrinks in extent, it also is shrinking in thickness. And by 2016, you're going to see there's very little of that old ice, old thick ice left. So here it goes, year by year. You can see the years going by. And as the ice gets thinner, you see there's more of that light blue color and less of the white color. And here's where we are then in 2016. Right, so 1984, 2016. Now, I got to see this for myself because in 2019, I stood where that red dot is on the northern shore of Alaska. And this is what I saw. I happened to be there on a beautiful day. But you can see the wind has blown icebergs into the shore, but there's no sea ice visible. And my guide told me that 25 years ago, we could have easily walked out onto the pack ice in early July. And so this heating of the Arctic is a potential tipping point because the Arctic soils contain enormous amounts of carbon, right? If you think about these tundra ecosystems, and this is because plants grow in the long summer, but then as it gets so cold, they don't decompose very quickly. That's why you can find creatures like this in the Arctic, but even though these guys roamed all over North America, you're not going to find anything but maybe a bone or two at our latitude. So as the Arctic warms, then this carbon in the soil starts to decay. And if there's oxygen, that forms carbon dioxide. If there's no oxygen, that forms methane. Both of these are greenhouse gases. And that means that the Arctic will heat up more because there are more greenhouse gases, but then that's going to cause more decomposition. And you can see that you get into a cycle where the Arctic becomes a big source of greenhouse gases, and there's nothing we can do about it. Right? So this permafrost melt, this is one of these tipping points we could get to. Another one is forests burning. Right? Major forest fires produce tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide, but that makes the world more arid and you can get more fires. As the ocean heats up, CO2 comes out of the ocean, just the way it comes out of your Coke as it warms up, right? We can see a weakening of the carbon sinks that pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So we're adding carbon to the atmosphere, but we're pulling it out more slowly. And that will lead to carbon buildup in the atmosphere. And we can see this with ice sheet melting too. And as the summit of Greenland is ice, right? As that ice melts and the ice cap gets lower, it's entering warmer air, which causes it to melt even faster. That's an example of a cascade of events that can result because of the temperature change because of more carbon dioxide. We could see changes in oceanic circulation as well. It's like dominoes falling. We know this will happen. It's happened in the past on the Earth, not while humans have been around. We just don't know when. And this is another reason why it's so essential that we step back from the edge by reducing our carbon emissions as fast as possible. In addition, climate change is an emergency because of the political cascades of events that will ensue when people don't have enough food or water and they have to move. The ex-director of the CIA, R. James Woolsey and colleagues, this is what they concluded in a study in 2007. We all have to decide for ourselves what we find profoundly disquieting. I found this picture profoundly disquieting. This is only with tens of thousands of people on the move. Imagine what it will be like when there are tens of millions, which is what's projected for the middle of this century. So if we go back to our questions, must we change? The answer is clearly yes. The sooner the better. So can we do this? Can we change? All I can say is thank heavens the answer to this question is yes too. Humanity already possesses the fundamental scientific, technical, and industrial know-how to solve the problem. We don't need to wait for new discoveries. We have everything we need to begin right now. We just need the political will. I'm going to show you an illustration of this. This yellow line going up represents our business as usual emissions if we don't do this, and we need to follow a path like this. And that means we have this triangle of emissions we have to forego. So how do we do that? A key strategic thing to understand is that there's no silver bullet here. There's no one thing to do. Analysts like to talk about silver buckshot. There's all sorts of things we have to do in virtually every sector. Let me just talk about a few of them. The ones that I think are the most, that we can get the most bang for our buck out of. The first is energy efficiency. Just getting the services we need by using less fossil fuel energy. We have shown in California how easy this is to do. This blue line is the electricity used per capita in the 49 other states in the Union, and the green line is California. And this happened because in the 1980s, we adopted energy efficient building codes and energy efficient appliance standards for California, and we allowed our utility companies, our regulated utility companies, to make money by getting us to use less energy. Traditionally, utilities made more money by the more energy that they sold. And we changed that model to make our utilities help us with this. A new refrigerator now in the United States gets 85%, uses 85% less energy than it did in 1980. And then we have new technologies coming online, efficient technologies like LED lights. Right? They were a novelty 10 years ago, but they're taking over the lighting market because they last so long and they use so much less energy to get the same amount of light. The next thing we've got to do is we have to electrify transportation. We're getting there. Electric cars made up over 6% of global vehicle sales in 2001. In 2021. And that tripled their market share from 2019. Battery-powered vehicles now account for more than 10% of new cars sold in Europe and about 20% of new cars in China. And also, recently, about 20% of new car registrations in the Bay Area. And US electrical vehicle sales rose 76% in the first quarter of this year, which doubled EV's market share, but that's only to 5%. But this change is already enormous from the perspective of the auto industry. Here's what the chief financial officer of Ford just said. And part of this is being driven by the fact that people like electric cars. Once they just get used to the idea they have to plug their car in every night when they come home, they have many fewer moving parts. They don't smell. You don't have to go to the gas station. They're really wonderful. Prices are coming down because battery prices are dropping precipitously. And so this is allowing, India and China and other nations to think about a full electric fleet. And the same thing, we can think about the same thing here in the United States. And we're already seeing some sectors that are easier to electrify, moving much more quickly, like buses, right? Almost all the world's electric buses are in China, but in California, all new buses have to be electric by 2029. And we're seeing new electricity coming into the truck market as well, both heavy-duty trucks and light-duty trucks like Amazon vans, right? So the next piece of the puzzle then is to get carbon-free electricity. It does no good to have an electric car if when you plug it in, you're getting electricity generated by burning coal. Again, here we have the technology, right? We have these technologies that are getting cheaper and cheaper, right? Onshore wind is plummeted in price, as has offshore wind. The same thing has happened to the cost of solar. And this has allowed solar energy to just leap beyond that green line, beyond projections that were made in the last decade. And solar is showing up in surprising places, like the Kentucky Coal Mining Museum, that put a solar array on their roof in order to reduce their electric bill. We also can have what we call natural carbon solutions. And this is the idea that because carbon is part of an ecological cycle, the amount of carbon on the planet is pretty much fixed and it just changes form, ecosystems can be part of the solution. And I'll show you now a diagram of the carbon cycle on the planet. And there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. On the left is photosynthesis, where it's brought into plants. The plants are eaten by animals. They breathe out carbon. Some of it goes into soil and over millennia into fossil fuels. And we've greatly accelerated the factory and vehicle emissions there on the right. And so we have to accelerate the uptake of carbon. And we can do this both with planting trees, but also by how we manage our working lands, our agricultural and our forestry lands. And this just shows what's called regenerative agriculture on the left, where we don't till as much and we plant a cover crop in the winter, and it results in a much more productive soil. This is a healthy soil that has drawn carbon from the atmosphere, and it's a win-win for farmers and the climate. And then we also, as part of this, need to stop cutting down forests. The last piece I want to show you is the idea of a price on carbon. And this is just reflects the fact that we live in a market economy, and markets allocate goods and services efficiently when the price in the market reflects the cost of production. But when that doesn't happen because there are costs external to the market, like pollution, then people get the wrong price signal. This is why we need to add a price on carbon so that consumers understand the cost of these actual cost of these products. In addition, we have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Right now, we subsidize fossil fuels more than renewables. And so we're getting more of what we don't want and less of what we want. So unless we make these changes, our market economy is actually working against our future health and safety. But the idea here is that with these pieces, then we have addressed that big triangle. And there are other slices we can look at too, at food waste, at changing how we grow food, at carbon capture and storage. These are not going to be easy, but they're possible. And the longer we wait, the harder it gets, right? We have to go here, but if we keep climbing this curve, then it becomes like we have to jump off an economic cliff to get to where we need to get to. You know, if we had followed President Carter's advice back in 1978, everything would have been easier, but that's water under the bridge. Now in California, we are growing our economy while our emissions decline, but this is just a small down payment on the declines that we have to have. Now, these renewable energy technologies are very, very labor intensive. There are going to be lots and lots of jobs in these fields. In fact, solar installer and wind turbine service technician are the fastest growing job categories in the US. And more than five times as many people now work in solar as in coal mining. But we have to recognize that you can't just eliminate coal mining as a part of a regional economy and say, go find a job in the solar industry in Arizona. I mean, that just is not going to happen. So part of our transition has to recognize the social upheaval here too, but that's a small slice of the overall cost. The economists are saying that the most expensive thing we can do is nothing. This was a letter sent to Governor Schwarzenegger in 2005. And now, with the drop in price of renewable energy, economists are saying things like this, right? The old narrative was that we transition to a renewable future, we pay a premium, but it's worth it because we avoid climate change and we avoid the health impacts of fossil fuels. But we've now reached a point where a renewable energy system, one that does not cause climate change or damage human health through air pollution, appears to be cheaper than the fossil fuel system that also saddles us with those other costly impacts. So the new narrative that's emerging is we'll pay a huge premium if we do not transition away from fossil fuels. So can we change? The answer is yes. But remember that last question, will we change? Well, we are. The question is, will we change fast enough? We have some unusual allies that are appearing, like the president of Appalachian Power, West Virginia's largest utility, one of our proudest coal states. And this is what he told his Republican governor. And just today, if you saw in the news, Joe Manchin suddenly had an epiphany, and now he wants to support a lot of the climate investment that President Biden has been pushing. We can see the drop in coal consumption already in the United States, although you'll note right at the end there, it popped back up. That represents the fact that as the Ukraine war has driven up the price of gas, that people are finding coal more economical again. Last year, we got to a point, or 2 years ago, where we actually started producing more electricity with renewables instead of with coal. And all the nations of the world have gotten together and agreed that we have a common problem. But to make this transition, it's going to require that all of us be the change we want and invest our time and energy in making this happen. This includes our transportation and food choices, right? Do we have to drive? Can we carpool? Can we walk? If it comes time to buy a new car, think about an EV. Please go drive one if you haven't. They're fantastic. And then our food choices as well. This is actually, there's a lot of carbon emissions embedded in what we eat, particularly if we eat beef, as we can see here. And I'm not saying that everybody should become a vegan, although if everyone became a vegan, our emissions would drop by like 25%. But you can change your carbon footprint of your diet by reducing the amount of beef you eat. And substituting chicken or pork or carrots, right? We need to conserve energy and water. Obviously, if we conserve energy, there's less emissions, but we use a lot of electricity in California to push water around. We can purchase renewable power ourselves through community choice aggregation organizations. I'm sure there's one in Rossmoor. Brad can tell you about it, I'm sure. This is also happening in the corporate world, and we see these energy purchase agreements becoming more and more popular as corporations seek to reduce their carbon footprint. In fact, the reason that the president of Appalachian Power said he wouldn't build any more coal plants is because he was trying to attract Google to put a data center in West Virginia because it uses a lot of electricity, the product he produces. Google wouldn't do it because there was too much carbon on their grid. We all need to be politically active. And this is not a part, it's a multi-partisan activity. It's, if you are a Republican and you're listening to me talk, please consider the values that you hold dear that have led you to identify as a Republican, and then use those values to advocate for solutions to the crisis. There is plenty of room to try all sorts of things. And as a Republican, your ability to advocate for this with Republican elected officials is really, really important, right? We can vote for candidates that understand this crisis. We can talk to our friends and our family and our colleagues. If you write an elected official, my first job was in my state assemblyman's office. And one of the things I did was open the mail. And I can tell you that if we got 5 letters on a topic, the member of the assembly knew all about it because he would assume that there were 5,000 people in the district who felt that this was an important issue. People are beginning to get active and speak up. And the key point here is that this kind of activity will generate a social tipping point. And that's what will allow us to change fast enough to address this urgent emergency that we're facing. And essentially, we need to decide as citizens of the world that fossil fuel use is dangerous and immoral. And then work for policies to be adopted to move us away. Here are some of these policies that we could adopt. We could remove fossil fuel subsidies. We could expand incentives for renewable energy. All of our building should be towards carbon neutral cities, towns, and businesses. When we invest capital, we have to be investing towards the future, not based on what the climate was that we lived in the past. We need to strengthen climate education and engagement so people understand that this is a real problem. We need to divest from assets linked to fossil fuels, and we need to have mandatory disclosure of climate risks in financial markets. Investors are becoming aware that if they're going to make a 20-year kind of investment, they need to be thinking about this company and what it does and what the world will be like in 20 years. We just need to make that mandatory now. And if we do that, we can stimulate the application of Dornbusch's law, which is this, that things take longer to happen than you think they will, but then they happen much faster than you thought they could. We saw this with marriage equality in the United States, and now we need to make it for climate action. Because as a scientist, I can tell you the reality is really, really heartfelt. You can see this quote. I like this quote from Andrea Dutton, which is that my scientific mind understands that this summer will be one of the coolest for the rest of our lifetimes unless we decide to treat the climate crisis like the emergency that it is. And that's why I think John McCain got it right when he said global warming presents a test of foresight, of political courage, and of the unselfish concern that one generation owes the next. And I can tell you the younger generation is waking up and realizing that those that they trusted to take care of them have actually let them down. If you have not talked to the young people in your life about this, I suggest that you prepare to do so, because they're coming and they're saying things like this. Remember, the climate change that's coming has already been decided by the emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere. The next 20, 30 years is already written. The question is whether we take action today so that our grandchildren inherit a planet with a stable climate. That's the question of our time, and our action and commitment will determine the answer. I hope that all of you will consider the words of Apollo astronaut Rusty Schweickart. He said, we're not passengers on spaceship Earth, we're the crew, we're not residents of the planet, we're citizens. And the difference in both cases is responsibility. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
I'm Larry Bryan. I am Vice President of Sustainable Rossmoor. And since Brad was in the back, I thought I would ask people if they had questions. I see in the chat that Carol, that you can opt up to 100% renewable energy, and she gave a link. And it turns out that with, I think at this point, it's actually cheaper to go 100% renewable than having non-renewables. So it will also save you money if you haven't already done it. Yes.
Addressing all of this to the U.S. citizens, I have heard that the Amazon is this fantastic. People are burning all the trees. You can't hear me?
You need to speak up. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
In Brazil, they are burning all the trees in the Congo to make, not the Congo, Amazon, to make charcoal, which they can then sell. So how do your words help us address some of these problems that are elsewhere in the world?
Okay, so that's a great point, and I think that it's, this is not that kind of of exploitation of the forest of the Congo Basin is not going to be good for the people of the Congo either. But if there's a saying that I often like to use, that there's no such thing as an environmentalist with an empty stomach, right? So if you don't have the capacity to earn an income any other way, you're going to cut down trees. And if that leads to to huge climate problems in the future, if that leads to landslides in your area, well, you'll deal with that later because you need to do that now. So it is in our interest, and there's been a tremendous amount of work done on this United Nations to help people in those countries and anywhere where there is a major forest. And this includes the United States, by the way. We are fighting to prevent our temperate rainforest in Alaska from being cut down, but to use these resources in a more sustainable way. But we, as the wealthy people who have produced this problem, it is our responsibility to work with the nations of the world to find ways for them to raise their standards of living without damaging the climate. And it takes money, but it can be done. It's not impossible. There's a lot of work in the Amazon, for example, with empowering the folks who live there to.
Okay, I can't unmute myself.
Pardon me?
And please continue. Someone is wanting to ask a question, but they need to let you finish your answer.
Okay, well, I'll just finish up, just say that there are definitely things we can do, but you have absolutely identified a vitally important problem. And it applies not just to folks in the Congo, but any place where people are living really day to day. You can't expect them to take action that is going to prevent them from putting food on the table. So you have to help them come up with a different way to put food on the table. We're finding, for example, that solar energy is expanding very quickly in Africa. Very small solar powered systems that just operate maybe a couple of lights, but just having light at night without having to buy kerosene and burn a kerosene lamp not only increases the health of people who don't have to breathe those fumes, but it allows them to be productive at night, to students to study, to people to sew and make things that they can sell. So there are ways that we can evolve any economy to make it more sustainable, but it does take capital. And part of the Paris Agreement, if you recall, was a major transfer of funds on the order of $100 billion to developing nations to help them with this. And so far, we haven't delivered on that promise.
Hey, I just wanted to ask you, there's been some talk in the media recently about Biden considering calling a national emergency with regard to climate change.
Yeah.
What can you say about that? Would it work? Would it?
Well, I think it's more important that we act like it's an emergency than that we call it a national emergency.
You do it, I can't do it. I'm not smart enough.
The Zoomers are not hearing the question.
I'm hearing a lot of people. If you could mute if you're not asking a question, it helps, because I can't tell if someone's asking me a question or just talking. So if the president declared a national emergency, it would give him certain additional powers. But there is so much that we need to do that I don't really think that we don't need to fall on our swords about this becoming an emergency. We need these policies, and some of these, if in fact Joe Manchin has changed his mind, and we now are going to get some of these tax policies that we were seeking to further expand renewable power, that's more important for addressing the emergency than for the president to declare a national emergency that gives him certain powers to implement various policies. I think that that I just like the fact the president's calling an emergency. And I think that we need to ask people who are saying it's not an emergency to explain why that is.
A question that Marsha Lieberson asked in the chat and asking about the number of years that we have if we don't make the needed change before we have.
The number of years we have before what?
Before civilization can no longer be able to.
Well, yeah. So what happens here is not that one day the planet catches fire and we all are consumed. What happens is that the impacts are more and more severe. It's kind of like a boxing match where the losing contestant eventually he's been pounded on for several rounds, and then there's one final swing and down he goes. We can already see this happening. If we look at some of our communities that have been hit recently by frequent hurricanes, and they're just, it takes a decade to respond, but if another hurricane comes after 5 years, it becomes very, very difficult. And you can see this on the coastline, particularly the Atlantic coastline, where sea level is rising a little faster. The Outer Banks of North Carolina, houses are falling into the ocean, and there's really nothing that we can do about it. So as these things accumulate, then where do those people go? Those people have to go live somewhere else. And those communities are probably unable to absorb those amount of immigrants. I mean, people tend to think about the immigration problem and the movement of people in terms of people crossing borders, but within countries, there already are problems like this. We will see as it gets hotter and hotter. What do you do? I mean, I think that we'll see actually that in Southern California and in Arizona and in New Mexico and Texas, that we're going to start taking siestas in the United States. We're just going to, we're going to, it's just too hot. Already in Phoenix, if you want to do a major concrete pour, you have to do it at night. So these problems will just accumulate, and it will get harder and harder and harder for us to keep up with the impacts. The richer you are, the better you will do. And so we will see in our poor communities, there will be more and more severe impacts. And then eventually, as people's capacity just to survive gets frayed, we'll see a breakdown, political problems that will appear. And we're already seeing that, right? As people are crossing from North Africa into the Mediterranean, across the Mediterranean, and the Italians and the Greeks and the Spaniards are struggling to deal with all these people. We're having the same problem at our southern border, where a lot of people are being driven by political instability, but also by the impact of climate changes.
Okay,
I see hands raised in the Zoom. Are you guys selecting people there as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Jacobs is here. I work on a lot of international projects in Mexico and in Africa. And what I find there, one of the biggest problems is that the world's population is increasing by 240,000 people per day. When I was born, the population of the world was 2 billion, and with very soon it could 8 billion. So when I work these countries, it's hard to see how you can deal with these problems unless you realize that currently every decade the world's population is going to increase by 1 billion. So in order to deal with this issue, it's not just a question of what energy consumption and how we use it. It has to do with population control, and that's a huge factor.
Well, I mean, yes, I certainly, the more feet we have, the more carbon footprint we have. But when you look across nations, I would argue that at present, this is a problem as much of consumption as it is a population. People in the United States, even though China produces the most emissions as a country, their per capita emissions are still well below ours. And the carbon that is in the atmosphere already is not there from the people who are going to be born tomorrow. It's there from all the people who've been alive and who have been living in a certain way. And so to just say that we have to stop population growth is, I mean, I think that what we have to do is empower women. And if we empower women around the world, population growth stabilizes. And so that to me is it's a much more effective way of looking at it. Certainly, the fewer people we have then the capacity to help everybody's standard of living rise without carbon emissions. But I think that right now, we have to accept as Americans that our lifestyle, what we can't have is we can't have everybody in the world live like Americans. If that happens, you're right, we're toast. So we have to help people improve their standards of living, but in a sustainable way. It's fascinating. I like to use the model of the cell phone, right? I mean, that people, a lot of people in developing nations, in rural locations, couldn't get access to telephone service when they had to get landlines laid down first. Now with the cell phone, it's revolutionized people's capacity. And in fact, there's so many, I think the number is 40% of the Kenyan economy moves through cell phone transactions, right? It's so the same thing could be true with other technologies as well. But it's a huge problem, and it does take a commitment. And my hat's off to you for the work you do. And we have to commit resources, real money, to helping these nations, because our future is bound with theirs now, in terms of we can't just count on the Atlantic and the Pacific keeping climate change away from us. And we all have to see that we have a common destiny.
You give the most fantastic talk on this subject I've ever heard in my life. I want to compliment you, and I hope you talk to the politician. You did a phenomenal job. I'm very
Thank you
impressed.
so much. I really appreciate that. Please, if you guys have any, the more people I can talk to, the better. As Brad said, this is something I've been doing for years, and I would love to talk to the Republicans of Rossmoor. So, I would love to talk to them. You can tell them I'm completely nonpartisan. It's very hard to get in front of conservative audiences to even talk as a scientist. Your help would be valuable.
Thank you.
So I see a couple of hands raised. Who wants to
I
speak?
think I'm next.
Okay.
I was just thinking that one of the primary solutions in the drawdown book was educating women, especially in these countries that are so, impoverished.
That's
But
where I
my
got
question as a medical editor of 17 years experience, with all these new diseases and the variants, COVID and monkeypox and what have you, do you think that the change in the climate is influencing the spread of these diseases?
Absolutely.
I mean, this is my hunch.
So I produce every 2 weeks. I produce a little summary of climate news. You can sign up for it if you want, my website. But just a couple months ago, I summarized an article that's talking about what the driver here is. The climate change is changing where animals are, and we are pushing our human habitat into traditional animal habitat. And so humans are now crossing paths with other mammals that we did not usually cross paths with.
Mhm.
And those mammals, like the bats in China, can have viruses that if they cross over into humans, this is what happens. And so the models are projecting that, in fact, there are going to be thousands over the next several decades. There'll be thousands of viruses. Now, they all may not be as successful as a coronavirus, but these things are going to happen more and more frequently, right? This is where Ebola was we had these Ebola outbreaks because the Ebola is carried by the apes in the forest, and it's the communities that interact with them where they can get that, and then it passes between people. And of course, it's much more deadly than the coronavirus. So, but that is absolutely going to happen, not just because I talked about the mosquitoes and the ticks, same thing with ticks, but it's also going to be just because there are going to be these novel viruses, novel to the human population that we're exposed to because animals and people are moving in ways they didn't before.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. I remember your visit here. It must have been about 4 or 5 years ago. I had a chance to meet you then, and what you've done is phenomenal. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we'll talk it up throughout the rest of the community.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Surely.
Karen Perkins.
I guess I'm next. Yeah, you're talking about a lot, but your presentation has been divided into, yes, climate change is real, and you gave us a very good presentation, an excellent one. And I saw you previously, and that's why I'm on here tonight. I was quite impressed. And then the other part seems to be, what can we do about it? And you say to be activist. Younger people are more activist, or maybe I shouldn't say that, but there's quite a lot of activism amongst youth, Extinction Rebellion, groups like that. They're actually engaging in civil disobedience over this issue. It's not even, shouldn't even be called an issue. It's actually, the most monumental crisis of our entire lifetimes. But really, when you say we have to work with other countries, I don't see how we can work with other countries. Most of the rest of the world is quite poor. As you said, if we'd have to have 5 planets in order to sustain the lifestyles of Americans. And we're going to have to modify our own lifestyles. But other than that, and perhaps not by much, but other than that, the US seems to be bent on being a hegemony, an empire that wants to dominate the entire world. And in the meantime, the global South, which is filled with people, far more population than Europe or the United States, they're very poor, and they're having trouble even getting energy. So I think we'd have to have a different, and where I'm getting with this also is, I don't believe we have a free market economy. How can you call something a free market economy when the government, at the behest probably of oil companies, is subsidizing fossil fuels? That's not a free market economy in my book. And there's many, many other reasons it isn't. But the other part of it is basically, capitalism, first of all, we're an oligarchy, far more than we are. 1% have more. 1% have more. And so anyway, my question, I'm going to make it kind of limited here. My question actually is that can capitalism actually survive? Because right now it looks like it's late stage capitalism, and it's bringing this whole planet down as it goes down, because no economic system lasts forever.
Yeah, I mean, if I said free market, you're right. We have a market economy, but we don't have a free market economy. We interfere in the market in all sorts of ways. It's one of our political pastimes to interfere in our own market.
Well, there was a market economy in slavery. There was a market economy in feudalism.
That's
that
right.
Very little.
My point is that a economic transformation we don't have the time for that. Bill McKibben says that winning slowly on climate change is the same thing as losing. And so we have to make the system that we have now work as fast as we can to change it. I think we're seeing a lot of change all over the world. You talk about the global South, and I can tell you that one of the fastest growing solar markets is in Kenya and in Ghana, and these communities where the solar is so cheap now. It is the cheapest way to get energy, and we are about to go on a battery production extravaganza around the world. And we need to find as cheap a ways as we can to do those and as least destructive as we can. But there's going to be a lot of change. Our political system is more of a problem than our economic system.
Our political system is owned by the corporations,
Well,
both
this
parties.
is right. So
Both parties. Both parties.
the fossil fuel industry has, and now that we can't control the money that's in our elections, then we have empowered the most that, those with the gold are making the rules, right? And so we have politicians whose only interest, unfortunately, is in getting reelected. And it's incredibly short-sighted. It just is so sad to me. And my hope is that, the largest portion now of our electorate are the people who are ages 18 to 35, right? And for them to step up and realize that they have the power to change our politics.
Politicians get their money from corporations, and the corporations don't want to change. They're the 1%.
Hey, Karen?
Excuse me, Karen, could you give some of the rest of us a chance, please?
Yes, thanks, Aaron. Adrian?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
I can't hear this. It's too loud. It's too low.
Could we get the question from Adrian, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So you hadn't really addressed the agricultural component to the problem and our need to change our dietary habits. We're going to have the same lobbying from the agricultural community that we have from, the coal and fossil fuel community. So it is somewhat of a political question, but I don't want us to get back into politics. I want us to get into what we can do about that. I know changing our diets is somewhat helpful, but you really didn't discuss and I don't know how much, and given this array of problems we have, the agricultural component is.
So when you include livestock,
Yeah.
agriculture, then agriculture produces a significant amount of emissions. I think it's 18%, something like that. And the livestock industry is just an enormous problem. Now, if we are successful at creating products like, the Impossible Burger, meat products that can eventually be cheaper than beef, then we will be able we'll certainly reduce deforestation because we won't need this ever increasing amount of pasture land. And that's the pasturing of cattle is one of the major drivers of deforestation in South America. And if we support organic agriculture and if we eat less meat, we are having an effect, and we eat all the time. So it's definitely something that we can do. And we can, Americans have already significantly decreased their consumption of meat over the last 15 years. It's very interesting. I was actually surprised by the number. I can't remember what it was I just saw, but it was a significant number. And then we can also empower our agricultural industries to be part of the solution because of their ability to operate in a way that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil. This is true on rangelands. It's true on farms, but we have a long way to go to figure out how to make that happen within our existing economic system. I mean, we have people in the industry who are doing it themselves and who are deciding that they want to be part. They don't want to be part of the carbon problem. They want to be part of the carbon solution. And there are some wonderful examples of farms that are thinking holistically, and you can buy their products. Now, often the products are a little more expensive, But that's, of course, because of the fact that you're not using the subsidized fuels in the production of the products. So we all have to do that. There are a lot of people working very hard. Every 5 years, the Farm Bill comes up. And the Farm Bill is an enormous pot of subsidies that has been created over decades and decades. So many of our public policies seemed smart 50 years ago, subsidizing, giving tax breaks to oil companies so we got more gasoline and diesel fuel. That seemed like a really smart idea in 1950 to most people. Now it seems a little short-sighted. We used to destroy all our wetlands along the edges of our communities that help mute the tide. Now we realize, oh, that wasn't too smart an idea. Same thing is true with agriculture, but the entrenched interests are so enormous, the amount of capital already invested in this existing system. But you can, if you hunt around, you can find these great stories of farmers in Nebraska who are recognizing that they can use less fertilizer, less pesticides, and they can make a farm that is more sustainable and more productive. And these guys are becoming evangelists within their own communities. And that's going to be really important. I can't, some 60-something scientist from Oakland, I can't go wandering into a farm in Nebraska and tell them what to do. They're not going to listen to me, right? But they are listening to their colleagues. And a lot of them are facing enormous problems associated with climate change too, with flooding, particularly in the Missouri River in 2019. That flood really opened the eyes of a lot of farmers that the system that they have with the levees they have is not going to maintain their farms. You can't farm land that's underwater. So you're on the right track, and you can also, you could take out agriculture and you can put in virtually every sector of our economy. And we have to figure out how to decarbonize. And some of this, like the creation of cement. Cement is created at a very high temperature that you get by burning natural gas. And you can't generate cement. It's very hard to generate cement with solar power. So there are solutions that are going to have to be devised for every sector of our economy. And if we had been doing this assiduously for 30 years, it wouldn't be as difficult a problem as it is now. But we haven't been doing that. And we simply have to get on with this. And this is where I'm talking about that social tipping point. If we can get to the point where everybody realizes, oh, I guess we just have to do this. We have to decide that we have to do this. And whether you're a farmer or you're an industrialist or you're a professor or you're a retired chemist, whatever it is that you do, you have to scan your entire life and figure out, how do I contribute less emissions, whether it's in my business or it's in my personal life. And but we can't do it with individual action alone. That's why we have to be politically active, because we need the government policies to drive our economy. And just like we have driven it in the past in all sorts of directions based on things we perceived as important, we now have to drive it in this direction of sustainability as fast as we can. And we're still going to have enormous problems in the future. And those of us who live in the Bay Area, we're kind of lucky because we get that marine layer. You get less of it in Walnut Creek than we do in Oakland. But we have kind of a natural air conditioner. And that's really great for us. But we're going to have to deal with sea level rise, and we have to deal with earthquakes. So there are all these things that we have to do. And it just like we have just spent billions of dollars retrofitting every bridge in California because of their potential to fall down in an earthquake. we can do the same thing with our communities as well. We do have the money to do this. But there are winners and losers, and those winners and losers are going to fight really powerfully if they see themselves as the losers, whether it's the agriculture industry or it's the oil industry or it's communities like Kern County that gets 30% of its revenue for its education and fire and police from the oil industry. What are they going to do? Where are they going to turn? Same thing in West Virginia. Where are these people going to turn? These coal communities. We all have to be in it together. And that's a very hard place to get to. But I think it's getting more and more obvious to people. It's getting more and more obvious to farmers. It's getting more and more obvious to everybody. So, but I'm not going to tell you that this is not an enormously challenging problem, because it is. And we are not meeting the moment yet. But we are getting closer. But we have to accelerate our transformation. So with that, I think I'm going to have to say goodnight. But thank you all for your interest in this subject. Thank you so much to Sustainable Rossmoor for having me out again. And if you have burning questions you didn't get to ask, Brad can get a hold of me and you can send them to me and I'll try and get you some answers.
Would you just give us that website for your newsletter? Or
If you go to andrewgunther.com and go to the section called News and Views, there's a little place where you can give me your email address and I will add you to the distribution list. All I do is send out climate news. I don't send out anything else. I don't give your email address to anybody. You can go on, if you go on the website, you can see examples of the newsletter and see if you want to subscribe or not.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming in. Thank you, Andy.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, guys. Can they hear me? No. We can set up by email.